And if I just hit that, then how do I know it's recording?
It should give us a little icon right there.
Okay, so it's recording.
It's my dark option.
And how do I stop share?
There's a red button that says stop share right next to where that recording button is.
Ah, thanks.
Right, it should now say recording up in the top left.
I got you.
I'm all right.
Let's see. All right.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for coming, y'all. Appreciate it. For the last 20 years, Melissa Wilkinson has served as an academic, teaching at various academic institutions and workshops throughout the country. She received her BFA in painting from Western Illinois University in 2002. Then went on to receive her MFA in painting from Southern Illinois University in 2006. Her work has been featured in wide-ranging publications throughout the country, including 3 editions of New American Paintings, Curator's Salon, and the Manifest Drawing Annual 4 times. She's shown in various galleries nationally and internationally, including South Korea, Canada, India, and Art Basel Miami, and has won numerous awards throughout her career. She's won several fellowships and grants, including the Arkansas Arts Council Fellowship in Painting in 2012 as a Woman to Watch, a Middle East Studies grant to create an image archive in Israel in 2016, a National Women in the Arts grant to do the same with backroom specimens at the Smithsonian in 2019. She's represented by On Center Gallery in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and her work is amongst hundreds of private collections throughout the country and abroad. She hikes regularly, enjoys making homemade pasta, and consistently attempts to make the best cup of coffee possible while living her best life. A life that mimics a geriatric woman, double her age, who happens to listen to 90s R&B. When she's not toiling endlessly in her basement studio, she can be found enjoying pretentious esoteric art film, TikTok, the good vibes of a hipster coffee shop, and cocktails she can't afford, like a Negroni. Negroni. No. Help me along with my friend Melissa Wilkinson, please.
So, buy me a Negroni in it. Today, I'm going to deliver a talk that I just recently gave at a conference in Asheville. I will apologize. I am kind of ill, so I might be blowing my nose here and there, but I'm fairly informal. So, generally I speak extemporaneously. So this is a little different than how I typically talk, but if you have questions, just sort of raise your hand. But I will talk for about 25 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time. I've also brought a little bit of work, just small work that I could bring to chat about. But what I really want to talk about to start is why Mariah Carey is the greatest of all time. So that's what we're going to talk about today, but just kidding. We're going to talk about me. As a studio artist and painter, my research focus is a traditional studio production of objects. My current practice focuses on the appeared body as appropriated from antiquated gender performance. Today, I'll be speaking on the evolution and historical contextualization of the appeared body in painting, using my own work as well as the art historical canon to draw from. I'll examine the conundrums facing figurative painters today, as well as discuss the process from conception to design and execution of my own creative research as an openly lesbian artist. More specifically, I will address the question of the feminine gaze, and use quotes there because that's up in the air whether or not I actually think it can exist, and personal motivations while investigating questions of desire in portraiture today. I'm interested in corrupting the familiar, and it is a game that I seek to play. For my paintings, I typically appropriate from existing images sourced from the Hollywood Golden Era, at least right now. Late 70s and early tomboys and heartthrobs, disco, and private Tumblr accounts. Yes, I'm still on Tumblr. These are personas that have informed my identity and personal sense of self. I further queer these images by creating a type of reassembled painting, one that bluntly combines dichotomous masculine and feminine expressions. I look to reorganize images to challenge gender and propose the absurdity of traditional presentations as both limited and binary. I paint these images in order to create a coveted object, one that holds, hours of considerate and loving application through a painterly meditation and mediation. They are hybridized portraits that complicate both vision and expectation. I seek to explore micro expressions, very small little affectations, gender play, and the exploration of my coming of age as a person. The painted portrait allows me a vehicle to express what the subject truly seeks, an encounter that is deeply complex and tender. The problem is often that the act of performing personhood, most specifically gender, is within the patriarchy is, to me, absurd. Influenced heavily by collage and digital intervention, I create meticulous watercolor and ink wash paintings in order to investigate what it means to labor on an object in the 21st century. I work in water media, on paper, to create a vulnerable object and a tender presence through my touch. All of my work relates to my interest in dichotomies, obscuring and revealing, attraction and repulsion, good and evil, the past and the present. Through a very tediously crafted watercolor painting practice, I seek to make something strange out of the ordinary. I am deeply interested in the interaction of parts and am attracted to the tactile in an increasingly technological and dehumanized era. I am a fetishist of objects. So the romantic process of painting allows me to mediate and meditate on issues of gender, identity, construction, and beauty. And though the paintings are initially conceived of using digital processes, i.e. Photoshop, they're made by employing a purist approach to watercolor, which has historically been relegated to a traditionally feminine preoccupation. In doing so, I endeavor to uphold these painting processes while dismantling the elitism and power structures within which they are often associated. These paintings incorporate appropriated imagery from popular culture, subjects suggestive of consumption and gender expression, and are deconstructed to recontextualize and agitate the viewer. Much of my work pendulates between the still act of looking and the rapid act of movement. Many of these images seek to express what is whitewashed from popular culture, queer joy. The only place we really see queer joy expressed publicly is drag, and currently it is in peril in many states. So I dig in. I dig in because that's exactly what I've done for almost all of my work since day one. Why? Because strangers wagging a finger at me in disgust while holding my girlfriend's hand repels me. Students stating that their parents forbid them taking my classes or be in a car with me is my motivation. Parents that don't show my wedding pictures or acknowledge anniversaries, or colleagues physically wincing when I mention my wife, can create even more solid foundation for my studio decisions. I choose to rebel through the work, especially in academia, with absolute delight. So let's talk about art history rather than my feelings. What then has been the function of portraiture then within the West? When looked at from a shallow perspective, Western tropes regarding the representation of power, beauty, money, accomplishments, genetic lineage, are all initial sociological functions of a portrait. However, great works working within these constraints sometimes communicate something further reflective of individual humanity. As we engage with the figure, one of the most psychologically charged vessels to represent, the images require something more difficult from us as the viewer. I propose that aesthetic value has only rarely been the primary inspiration in the commissioning, display, and reception of portraits. It discusses the different functions that portraits and portrait collections have fulfilled. It includes, sections of the portrait as essentially a biography. The portrait can be a document, the portrait as proxy and gift, the portrait as commemoration and memorial, and the portrait can be a political tool. Alternative choices in subjects, like the disenfranchised, the infirm, the queer, the disabled body, translate very differently when depicted with dignity. The challenge from an artist's position, however, lays in the conundrum of establishing both noble individualism while honoring difference within the traditional lens. If we think about bodies represented through portraiture that are atypical to the white Western canon but exist within it, the portrait of Jean-Baptiste Bellay comes to mind. Like many other former enslaved people, Jean-Baptiste Bellay fought in the American War of Independence and partook in the Haitian Revolution, a revolt involving all Black people in Haiti, whether they were enslaved or free. This work depicts Jean-Baptiste Bellay standing turned to a hard left, which is a formal code that indicates movement toward the future. A statue of Guillaume Thomas Raynal, an abolitionist French philosopher, sits directly behind Bellay's right. Though both men sit ideologically in the same space, one looks to the past while the other one looks to the future. Contemporary artist Kehinde Wiley approaches men on the street in a fashion very similar to cruising. He asks them to pose for portraits appropriated from historic European portraits. These men of color are always asked to wear their best gear and postured to appear both powerful and effeminate, dignified and ornately decorated with floral patterns, and it's a pairing that explores the tension between machismo and hip hop and the vulnerable act and loving act of looking. So the representation of queerness is nothing new in portraiture. Personal individual narratives were not represented overtly because of legal and social constraints. What then becomes self-censorship and floats to the top, typically as queer coding. Micro-expressions such as postures, posing, or even visual puns were heavily utilized. Let's look very closely at that queenie pose and almost vulgar book-hand gesture. Most scholars conclude, based on a series of sonnets Bronzino wrote upon Pontormo's death, that the two men enjoyed a more intimate relationship than that of master and pupil. Later in his life, in 1552, Bronzino also literally adopted, a grown male, one of his own pupils, Alessandro Allori, as his son. In 16th century France, this type of arrangement often signaled a sexual relationship between the two men. An older man adopting a younger lover was quite common, and the two artists lived together until Bronzino's death in 1572. Originally, in his 3 essays on sexuality, Sigmund Freud isolated scopophilia as one of the component instincts of sexuality, which exists as drives quite independently of the, this is a hard word, erotogenic zones. Why not just say erotic? At this point, he associated scopophilia with taking other people as objects, subjecting them to a controlling and curious gaze. What is scopophilia? It literally means the love of looking. This painting depicts a Mahu individual from Hiva Oa, not a man in a cape, as Gauguin describes the individual to the Western standards of gender, who identifies with a third gender that can encompass both male and female roles, presentation, and even some spiritual aspects, as Mahu individuals were revered as healers. The conversing fox and bird at the bottom right of the image are natural enemies with many differences. This is perhaps Gauguin's way of portraying male and female genders, conversing and getting along with one another to symbolize the Mahu's individual gender. The chimera, if you're not familiar with it, is a mythical monster. All of this plays a role in what I'm thinking about. It's a hybrid of a lion, a snake, a goat, and it terrorized the ancient Greeks' countryside, breathing fire and providing endless fascination built on the notion of a genetic hiccup or disruption against nature. This manufactured monstrosity has been used in literature and cultural studies as a means to challenge the hierarchical binaries of nature and culture, self and other, male and female, human and non-human. In his seminal work, Monster Theory 7 Theses, J.J. Cohen asserts that the word monster means that which reveals and that which warns. A monster is an embodiment of any given society or cultural fears. They are like a time capsule almost, a window into culture. In The Monster is a Cultural Mirror, Cohen stipulates that monsters are a reflection of their culture and mirror to contemporary zeitgeist. The monster, therefore, is not what it is, i.e. a wolf man, a vampire, but it is also what it signifies, what it projects, represents, reflects. The sexual ambivalence of the sleeping hermaphroditos is more disquieting today than it would have been to ancient viewers, who knew the history of the son of Hermes and Aphrodite. For Hermaphroditos had rejected the advances of the nymph Salamaces, and she in her distress asked Zeus to merge their two bodies into one forever. Hence the strange union of voluptuous female curves with male genitalia. The late Hellenistic date for the original work from which this is a Roman copy was made is based on the theatricality of the work. The first impression is that it's a sensuous female nude, and then the surprise on the other side in very realistic detail. What do I love about this work? The provocation of erotic looking that counters the viewer's presumed self-identification and self-identified sexual orientation. The audience is tricked, and the only person threatened is the one who hasn't come to terms with ambiguous desire. It is one of two responses, delight or anger, and that says a lot about the person looking. Wakashu, the term, is a term that translates to male use in the visual culture of Japan's Edo period. It ran from 1603 to 1868. It's a third gender primarily, and it proves that transgressing gender binaries has occurred throughout art history. However, in an exhibition curated by Asato Ikeda, he argues that the Wakashu actually stood apart from the gender binary as a third ambiguous gender, Adolescent boys before their coming of age ceremony, a date that would vary depending on the boy's economic means. Basically, they were seen as erotic objects sexually available to both men and women. This is Claude Cahun, expressive, playful, and subversive, and very often playing with gender identity. Cahun was a French surrealist photographer, sculptor, and writer. Claude Cahun's most remembered works are the highly staged self-portrait tableaux that do incorporate the visual aesthetics of surrealism. During the 1920s, Cahun produced an astonishing number of self-portraits in various guises, such as an aviator, a dandy, a doll, bodybuilder, vampire, angel, and a Japanese puppet. Quote, "My role," she wrote in an essay published after her death, "was to embody my own revolt and to accept at the proper moment my destiny, whatever it may be." Gluck, born Hannah Gluckenstein, was a British painter who rejected any forename or prefix, such as Miss, as Gluck was gender nonconforming. Gluck joined the Lamorna artist colony near Penzance. Yes, that's a real place. The Pirates of Penzance. Excuse me. And was noted for portraits and floral paintings, as well as a new design of picture frame. Gluck enjoyed intense lesbian relationships with Nesta Obermer and others. The artist's joint self-portrait with Obermer, known as Medallion, is viewed as an iconic lesbian statement. They wore a butch style inspired by menswear trends at the time, which signaled them to other lesbians as same-sex attracted women. With both women having financial privileges, many people who didn't acknowledge or know the symbols of lesbianism simply saw the androgynous women as flaunting their wealth in unique ways. Andy Warhol also enjoyed dressing for parties in drag, sometimes in dresses of his own design. He admired the, quote, "the boys who spend their lives trying to be complete girls," unquote. So in 1981, he and a photographic assistant, Christopher Makos, agreed to collaborate on a session portraying Warhol in drag. In many ways, they modeled a series of Man Ray's 1920s work with French artist Marcel Duchamp, in which the two artists created a female alter ego named Rosé Salave, or C'est la vie. Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray, compatriot Dada artists influencing the zeitgeist, collaborated in a number of creative endeavors in New York, including the creation of a female alter ego for Duchamp, named Rosé C'est la vie, a pun on the French pronunciation Eros, c'est la vie, sex, that's life. It was just one of the many attempts to tease ideas about identity and self-representation, particularly in portraits of himself. Strangely enough, often when men look at my images, they see male subjects. When women do, they see themselves. So the Greco ideal is also a trope that I seek to explore and deconstruct, both literally and figuratively. And I think about the chimera as I bridge these disparate parts toward the unified whole, which is why the entire series is called Chimera. And that's a mistake. I shouldn't have put that as. What then is the difference between queer art and queering art? According to the Tate glossary, queer art is, quote, art of homosexual or lesbian imagery that is based around the issues that evolved out of the gender and identity politics of the 1980s. However, simply defining queer art made by people who are homosexual or lesbian is a reductive, and defining queer people as those who, it's reductive because it only defines queer people as those who are in same-sex relationships. Whilst love, sex, and desire are often themes within queer art, it is problematic to focus merely on this as the context of queer theory. However, quote, queering is something we do rather than something that we are or not. Laura Mulvey is predominantly known for her theory regarding sexual objectification on women in the media, more commonly known as the male gaze theory. Mulvey believes that women are in fact the bearer of meaning and not the maker of meaning in imagery, which suggests that women are not placed in a role where they can take control of a scene. Instead, they are simply put there to be observed from an objectified point of view. In addition, she believes that the way of watching film is never alternated, so that the men, in fact, are quite the ones, the ones who are being viewed in this manner. This inequity enforces the ancient and outdated idea that men do the looking and women are being looked at. Gaze, G-A-Z-E, not gaze, is a psychological term. It describes the anxious state that comes with awareness that one is being viewed. The psychological effect is that the subject loses some sense of autonomy upon realizing that she or he is the visible subject. This is related with her her/his mirror stage in which a child encountering the mirror realizes that he or she has an external appearance. That's from Looking or Being Looked, The Power Dynamics of Looking by Najendra Bhandari. In the introduction of John Berger's Ways of Seeing, he states that the manner in which we perceive images, most notably paintings and artworks from the past, tell us more about ourselves than the works themselves. Quote, and so she comes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as two constituent, yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. So the surveyor is always presumed to be masculine, and the surveyed is always presumed to be feminine. Thus, she turns herself into an object, and most particularly, an object of vision or sight. Shout out, Moret. Another quote, men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. In the art form of the European nude, the painters and spectator owners were usually men, and the persons treated as objects usually women. This unequal relationship is so deeply embedded in our culture that it structures the consciousness of many women. They do to themselves what men do to them. They survey, like men, their own femininity. Therein lies the complex dilemma facing the queer figurative artist today. To address the place of portraiture today, to combat antiquated and conventional depictions of masculinity and femininity, to present queer desire often disempowers the subject. I reform these outmoded figures from history as a means to reclaim and question the toxic inheritance of their unaltered origins. My identity as a lesbian must be taken into account when engaging with the questions I posit through these paintings. Got a little video here. These are paintings executed very slowly as a form of monastic meditation that allows me the space to consider issues of power, oppressive systems, desire, and tenderness. The history of watercolor is one of feminine preoccupation, like we discussed, often dismissed by the Academy as merely preparatory, and as a Sunday afternoon hobby for women of higher classes. Although often questioned as redundant in the era of easy imagery and quickly produced digital print, my labor and time is actually currency. This currency enfranchises my voice as both viewer, creator, and woman. If we as viewers are always presumed to have a masculine lens, then we are complicit consumers of these bodies. What then happens when the body is disrupted? What then happens to issues of desire when the body is outrightly queer? How does a lesbian woman who is conversant in the problem of the body today represent an attempt to engage with the gaze? I choose to acknowledge it from a postmodern lens. I corrupt and glitch the image initially to lean into the objectification in order to confront the implicit power imbalance in the act of looking and consumption. I hope to confront the most important question that I faced in coming to terms with my own orientation through the action of portrait painting. Do I want to be her, or do I want to be with her? Thank you. Yeah, 24 minutes. Boom. Usually I yap on for like an hour.
Will you put up one of your favorites or something?
I don't know.
Yeah, choose.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Sleeping Ganymede. And it's one of the Chimera. Do you know the myth of Ganymede? Ganymede was a young man in ancient Greece who fell in love with the moon. But the moon can't really be with a boy. And so she made an arrangement with Zeus he basically would sleep eternally so that she could gaze upon him every night and admire his beauty. And it's one of the first instances in mythology where the action of admiring male and masculine beauty from an empowered woman actually exists. Yeah. It's taken from a Bob Miser. Bob Miser was a photographer in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of an underground kind of subtextual queer gay publication of muscle men. Where all those poses came from was all about bodybuilding, physique pictorial. So I use him a lot. Yep.
Do you create the images digitally first and then paint from that?
Always. I talk to my students a lot about this. A lot of people are disappointed at my shows because I know exactly what the image is going to look like before I paint it. It's all like my drawing process. I used to, draw. Now my drawing process is Photoshop collage. So I make a mock-up before I paint anything. There's very little discovery in the action of painting for me. It is very rote. It's very machine-like, and that allows me a kind of space to sit with ideas in a different way. Some people paint for discovery. I'm not that painter. Yeah.
When people associate this to be your work and look at this as you, do you feel like it's erasing other parts of your artistry and that you've been minimized to being a queer artist?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Like, do people look at this kind of work and be like, oh, this is your work, this is what you do? Do you feel like that minimizes all the other work you've ever made and that you're only a queer artist and that you only make work about this? If that's too personal, like,
No, I've never thought about it. In many spaces I walk in, I am a token. I do not fit into the conventional expectations of what a woman should look like to carry herself. That's not something I grapple with. I move through bodies of work, and they're all meant to be in dialogue with each other, and so that doesn't necessarily. If I'm dismissed by it, that would be a problem, but I have to think about that. I don't have a good answer for that here. If I'm dismissed by it, that would be problematic. But no. Yes, sir.
Years ago, I taught art appreciation at the height of that Serrano controversy with the Piss Christ, and then Mapplethorpe was around the same time, I think. And so you show those things in the classroom and you warn the students beforehand. But then there's all that stuff in Florida with Michelangelo's David, and so I wonder how you approach that in the class, because you just talked about being dismissed. So I wonder how you approach that in the classroom, given all this stuff that's going on right now.
In all honesty, I've taught in the South for almost my entire career. Texas, Arkansas, and now here.
Wait, this is the South?
As much as we all like to think that this is a haven of the liberal pursuit and sport, I've literally been called dyke on campus by girls. Like, I am deeply worried about a sensitive student who, and generally I don't show stuff like that in class. I'm very careful about what I typically show to my students in a professional artist talk. I'm worried about what is happening deeply and have been. It's not something that is new though. And it's certainly not something new that I've experienced in academia. It's finally at this point at 42 years old though that I think bring it. I'll sue everybody. Like, I mean, if the fight is coming, like, I've just come to terms with that. I think a lot of people who have bodies or experiences or backgrounds or identities that force them to the fringes have to just sort of live with that as a reality. And the news cropping up is honestly nothing new. The law is being passed, nothing new. Attitudes and oftentimes the community climate speak louder in the everyday experience. So if it comes, it comes. It takes one student complaint to put me in peril. What am I going to do about it? So if we actually stand behind these values of what higher education is about, then it takes a lot of people with better platforms, more solid footing, to be able to support faculty who are in sidelines. But I'm not going to say what that is.
And then we do not think about other people's problems with us. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about. You said we talked about your brother, student, and how that is really important.
Yeah.
And then also how it's sort of clean laying out the words allows you a meditative space. Kind of think about the issues within you. I kind of love that. Could you say a little bit more about what that's like?
Remember how I said I dig in?
Yeah.
When I was in graduate school, I did part of my MA work, which I ended up not taking. was I reproduced my entire WASPy family photo album in exact scale and dimensions, and you were to just move through it. Each one was a watercolor, right? And somebody engaged, one of my professors who's on my committee said, you know, I'm not really interested in the work as much as I'm interested in the fact that you're making it. And it was so dismissive and like, it felt like a punch in the gut. And I was like, yeah, let's read about it. So I became like the machine so that my labor and redundancy had to be wrestled with. Because what's the difference between this and painting a still life in exact verisimilitude? What's the difference? That labor oftentimes, like, and I come from poverty, I come from people who didn't go to college. Most of them just sit in front of the work and say, can't you just paint me a pretty landscape? And so that is like, I want the work to have a big umbrella. And so the technical component of what I do allows for that umbrella to be pretty wide and allows for an entree to a wider audience that might not otherwise look at it because they're impressed by the skill. Because it's real hard to copy a photograph, but it's not. It's not. It's hard to commit to it for 20 years and to do it again and again.
I got a follow-up question. So, a lot of the images that you're thinking about and further using in this work that's kind of creating a queering space is stuff that actually exists out there in the world. And I wonder if you've thought about how prefabricating or pre-imagining work using AI might come into this work, because I'm just thinking about the Republicans and have you found them yet?
The Republicans.
The
Republicans.
They are,
Sorry, I don't watch it.
oh, no.
Is that what that means?
No, it's a project that these small gay guys.
I've seen that.
Seen them, yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
They're called the Republicans.
I haven't figured out an interesting technical way to incorporate AI. I think it's the next step.
So they're like describing an imagined queering. And then collaborating with the AI to make it happen.
Yeah, there's a writer slash artist, but writer out of India who is making these amazing sci-fi spaces. They're not even sci-fi of Hindi gods and goddesses in like a gay club. They're amazing. Because that fluidity about gender and like safe space and like the interior, they're amazing.
Yeah.
So I haven't figured out a way to do it yet, but it absolutely is something I am interested in. I think that a lot of painters are losing their effing minds right now about AI. Their hair is on fire, but the reality is painters are really good to adapt to technology.
The reason I bring it up is because I feel like there's a really interesting tension between the past and the future, which AI is also this really interesting. It's drawing on everything in the past to create whatever you imagine about the future. So there's.
I'm most interested regarding AI, not in its seamlessness, but in its failures. I am most interested by the ham hot dog fingers that don't quite, like, I'm interested in the glitch of the like ravenous people eating with teeth, and the problems with AI. I'm much more interested in that. Because my work is about beauty and monstrosity, how the world sees you versus an embrace of queer culture. So if I were to actually like pull that in, that's what I'm not interested in like the seamless reality that is created by AI at all. Yeah.
I'm curious, at least just looking at the works you've selected here, a lot of the bodies here at least code as white. And given the way that the queerness that we do see in mainstream culture, with very few exceptions, is so often white queerness, right? Or queer whiteness or whatever. Where does race play into your work, if it does?
So I'm coming from really antiquated imagery that is already very, very familiar. And that is an imagery that pulls directly from the Hollywood Golden Era. And
Which is white,
Mhm.
or at least passing of white.
So they're not queer images, they're queer images.
Yeah.
So regarding, and I do portraits of, I've got, a good handful, but that is something that I struggle with, right? Whose version of popular culture am I painting, and what rights do I have to claim that I can disenfranchise the Black body further than it's already been disenfranchised? So when I paint Eartha Kitt, you know, I think, "Ugh, I don't know if I feel right doing this because it's not my story to tell."
But she would love it.
You know, she would. She, you know,
I don't.
but yeah, that's a struggle, right? Because my work is not about being inclusive. My work is about pulling from something that was never inclusive and it was never intended for everybody, which is the golden era, which set up these archetypes and these tropes of both masculinity and femininity and whiteness and style, and beauty conventions. Like, they're absurd. So my intention is to sort of make them even more absurd, and folding in the Black body into that in a way that disempowers them is not something I think I feel right doing.
Yeah. And if there's, like, I don't know, I was thinking like Merle Oberon or Rita Hayworth, of these interesting figures who were, you know, either of mixed race heritage or whatever, and, you know, functioned in that world by passing white. And there's interesting ways maybe. You know, that's an undeveloped thought.
You ready for lunch? Thank you for attending. I did bring a handful of paintings, just small ones, that I'll put out if you guys want to cut them out before you walk out, but you're welcome to it. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
You play Mariah Carey in your studio?
Who does it?
Hey, John. If I just end the meeting, it'll stop, it'll save, right?
I usually stop the recording just to make myself.
So I go to recording and just stop it right here?
Yeah.